Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SSHRC, or Carleton University.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking Joan and Dara and Marcus for inviting me and all the work in organizing and leading and planning this event. So today I'm going to be speaking about internet voting in Canada and in Europe. So to date, aside from a few jurisdictional cases here or there, such as Australia, the US, India, the majority of internet voting activity has taken place in Europe and Canada. In fact, for about 10 years, it seemed as though these two areas were sort of the worldly hotspots for the adoption of the technology. In the fall of 2014, John and I attended the International eVote conference in Austria. And while we were there, we learned that while the adoption of electronic voting machines for the casting and counting of ballots was growing around the world and really taking off in Europe and Latin America, internet voting uptake had substantially subsided. Many trials and programs were terminated in most areas of Europe that had been started or had been ongoing. Only in two places did internet voting programs continue. Those were in Estonia and Switzerland, and in both of these, the future of internet voting at the time seemed to be rather tense and dynamic. For example, in Zurich, internet voting had been stopped due to technical issues, and the Estonian authorities were comprehensively examining and developing verification mechanisms, and so it was a little bit uncertain as to what was going to happen there. The quieting of internet voting activity in Europe was an interesting development because at the same time, uptake in Canada was growing dramatically. It was expected to double in the next couple of years. And so this situation raises a very interesting question. And today I'm going to speak briefly about this issue and frame my talk around the question, why is internet voting adoption growing in Canada while seemingly declining in Europe? And so the reasons that I'm going to suggest for this hesitancy are impact on voter turnout, involvement from higher levels of government, centralization, decentralization, technical and security issues, budget issues, and public attitudes. So just a little bit about the history of elections and technology. Technology is not new to elections whatsoever. Ever since the state started taking a role in the administration of elections, we've seen systems implemented in types of technology. So even, a simple paper and pencil system is one type of technology framed. Oops. Sorry. Let me go up here. I might have to just wing it without the notes here. Yes. So for paper and pencil, but in terms of more computerized technologies, There we go. In terms of more computerized technologies, in 1869, Thomas Edison applied for a patent for an electric vote recorder. Then in the late 1890s, we saw mechanical level devices being used in New York. In the 1950s, optical scanners, 1960s, punch card technology, and then in the 1960s and 70s, electronic voting started to take off, particularly for counting. So over time, we've seen a gradual transition to digital-based technology. And around the 1990s, late 1990s, early 2000s, there was this feeling of cyber optimism, let's say, in Europe and in North America as well. And so this is a time, to put it in context, when voter turnout had been declining. And at the same time as voter turnout was declining, particularly among young people, we were seeing a rise in technological adoption. And so this made a lot of people very excited because they thought, okay, what if technology can be leveraged to help counter these participation declines? So technology at the time, for voting at least, was seen as a means of improving voter participation, and maybe it could be the magic bullet solution that could make electoral institutions work better for democracy. Some other reasons include improved convenience and choice for voters, modernizing the systems along with the rest of society. making voting available for special groups of citizens, such as citizens abroad, students, persons with disabilities, efficiencies in election administration, leadership in e-government and modernizing, and trust in the technology at the time, even though it was early 2000s, was quite high. And now public attitudes have shifted a little bit. So the first instance of internet voting was in the 2000 Arizona Democratic State primary, and it went off rather well. They received a record number of votes, and almost half of those were cast by internet. So shortly after that, we see a flurry of activity in Europe. In the UK, they did local trials in 2002 and 2003. In Austria, there were some trials with the Student Union and the Federal Chamber of Commerce. Estonia started with internet voting in 2005. France trialed it. The Netherlands trialed it in 2004. And Switzerland began in 2003. Those are just some cases. Other countries, such as Norway, have used it, but they just didn't use it at that specific time. So the current state of internet voting looks quite a bit different. There's currently about 6 countries that are expanding and exploring programs, but only 3 of those have more established programs that are not pilots, and they're not just offered for special groups of citizens. So Australia, for example, uses internet voting in New South Wales, but it's more of a pilot. France for expats, and India is piloting the technology as well. But Canada, Switzerland, and Estonia have more developed programs. So the current context. In Canada, sorry, I'm just going to see if I skipped a, no, okay. So the current context in Canada. So far, by the end of 2016, 130 governments will have used internet voting for over 230 elections. In Nova Scotia, which is one of the provinces here, 33 of 51 municipalities, it might even be more than that, but this is how many have committed to it to date, will be using internet voting in the fall local elections. And in Ontario, which has a sizable number of provinces, 414, and is Canada's largest province, we're projected to see that go above 200 municipalities in the forthcoming 2018 elections. Including Toronto. So there'll be about 6 to 7 million electors in Canada that will have the option to vote, in Ontario, sorry, that will have the option to vote online. What's really interesting is that we may actually see even maybe 300 use it, because the province has introduced this new initiative where municipalities can use ranked choice voting if they choose. But municipalities in Canada run elections for school boards, and they also run elections for municipal seats. And they're allowed to use ranked choice voting for municipal seats, but they cannot use ranked choice voting for school boards. So a lot of municipalities will be running elections with 2 voting systems, and they don't want to be responsible for counting those ballots. So a lot of them will turn to technology as a means of facilitating those elections. That's just an interesting point. First Nations in Canada are also starting to adopt internet voting more and more. There have been over 15 First Nations communities in Canada that have used the technology since 2012, and there's many, many more that are eager to start. There's also interest from our federal government here. We have a new federal government, and they plan to launch a parliamentary committee on electoral reform. And then the province of Ontario is actively pursuing modernization, just a little bit more slowly. So the context for Europe, for Switzerland and Estonia, I mean, they still are carrying on with their programs. They're still maintaining their programs, but there have been little blips of time when things have slowed down, or it may have looked like things were slowing down. So in Switzerland, for example, they've used it for mainly referendums, but at all levels of government. But in Geneva, we saw it slow down between 2005 and 2008. In Zurich, between 2011 and 2015. And then there was another kind of issue. And Alex, did they ever sort that issue out? Have they sorted that out now in Zurich? Do you know?
The last thing I heard from Robert Krimmer is that this has been taken away now.
Yeah.
The problem. I'm not clear either.
Yeah, so there's issues in Zurich. There's not the same type of uptake as there is in Canada. In Estonia, there was, in 2011 and 2013, they hit over a 20% threshold. And that raised a bit of concern in terms of, okay, if we're having over 20% of our electorate vote by internet, Now this method of voting is becoming more valuable to people, and now it's going to be more valuable for hackers who might want to try and compromise an election or sway the outcome of an election. And so they have been developing verification mechanisms, and so it wasn't clear exactly. They have proceeded as scheduled with internet voting, but it wasn't clear exactly if things were going to be halted or not. And in the rest of Europe, some examples of trials or pilots that have tanked or been terminated. In Austria, they didn't continue. The Netherlands, they didn't. Norway, and the UK. So turnout. So why is turnout a factor and why internet voting is declining in Europe, but it's doing well in Canada? Well, for one, the hype around internet voting has largely subsided in Europe. And I would say this in terms of, if we look at this two ways, one in terms of the current academic research, but also in terms of subjective evaluations of the jurisdictions based on the trials. So if we look at some recent research, there's a really interesting paper that was recently written on Swiss referendums, comparing the cantons of Geneva and Zurich, and looking at whether internet voting has an effect on turnout on top of postal voting, and they found that it did not. In Estonia, there's mixed results. Alex and his colleagues, I believe, they looked at the 2009 local elections. They found about a 2.6% increase. But there's been analyses of the 2007 Estonian election by Daniel Boschler, and he attributed turnout to changes to other factors. So the jury seems to be out. But in terms of government opinions, there seems to be a consensus that internet voting is not going to solve turnout. It's not going to be the Band-Aid solution that they hoped for. In fact, the UK is an excellent example. In 2000, not having much luck with this PowerPoint. Did you want me to, should I plug the computer in or just keep going?
That's fine, I'll work on it.
Okay. In the UK, for example, they trialed internet voting and a whole range of different voting types in 2002 and 2003. And when internet voting and other technological types of voting didn't improve turnout in all cases, they cut the pilot. They said, okay, let's cut it. So subjectively and based on statistical research, there's not really that much of an increase in Europe. But there's more optimism in Canada, definitely more optimism in terms of academic studies and anecdotally as well. So I've just completed a 3-year project with my colleague Leah Stokes, collecting election data from Ontario municipalities for 5 elections from 2000 to 2014. And we look at the use of internet voting over time among municipalities, and we find an effect of 3.5 points controlling for other factors. So it's not too much higher than 2.6%, but it is optimistic. And when you talk to the municipalities that are using internet voting in the communities, they are much more optimistic. Anecdotally, we see increases of 40, 50, 100%, 300%. Markham is an example. The first election they adopted internet voting, they saw an increase in turnout of 300%. So is this attributable to internet voting statistically? Well, we can't say, it's an anecdotal example, but the communities are observing these anecdotal increases if they follow these specific best practices, and so there's much more optimism about a positive turnout impact. Next, involvement from higher levels of government. We typically see involvement from higher levels of government in Europe. Trials are often centrally controlled, or in cases where they are not centrally controlled, we still see some kind of central interference or participation, let's say. So the Swiss example is a great example of that. The trials or the internet voting development in Switzerland has been characterized as decentralized, but the federal chancellery has played an active role in deployment and development of the program. Specifically, when it started, 80% of funding came from them. And there's been other instances. Whereas in Canada, among municipalities and First Nations, they have relative autonomy to sort of do what they would like. Now, municipalities are creatures of the province in Canada. They're not part of the Constitution. Their elections acts are actually written by the province, but so long as there is a provision in those acts which allows them to trial or use internet voting, they're free to do what they like. First Nations are a little bit different. there's a whole bunch of different codes, and I can talk about that in the Q&A, but for the most part, about 300 of our 614 First Nations are able to do what they would like for their elections. And this has done a few things. I mean, it's created sort of less rigor, but it has allowed the communities to become innovation laboratories and experiment with this and continue with it, whereas federal interference or subnational interference in other areas may have slowed things. Security or technical issues is another issue. European systems are arguably much more comprehensive. They've placed a greater emphasis on verification. So the idea of verification, I mean, there's individual verification and universal verification, but the simple idea of individual verification is that you can verify that your ballot was, cast as intended, counted as intended. There's no mention of this in Canada. So in Europe, there's much more of an emphasis on security, which is taking more time, and in Canada, there's not so much of this emphasis. This likely has to do with higher levels of government being involved in internet voting programs, whereas in Canada, it's the municipalities that are left up to themselves to do it. Majority of the municipalities that are using this technology are quite small, less than 25,000 electors. So as you can imagine, they don't have the resources or budget to be exploring things like this. And part of this also has to do with policies and standards when it comes to security. So in Europe, for example, there is much more of an emphasis on sort of developing some type of standards. Maybe not in all cases, but in Canada, there is no emphasis on standards. And it's all the policy, if there is any, is very piecemeal. It's one-off. And it's developed by the municipalities themselves. There's no overarching framework. There's no European Council of Recommendations. There's nothing like that. And it takes time to develop these policies. So because this implementation, this policy development hasn't been required in Canada, that may be another reason why things are moving more quickly. Finally, budget issues and public attitudes. I'll move through this quickly. Budget crises in Europe has been cited as one of the reasons that caused jurisdictions to reconsider perhaps developing technology in elections. Whereas in Canada, some local governments are actually adopting it to save money. It can reduce the cost of voting anywhere from $4 to $6 an elector to $2 to $3. This has particularly become a concern for communities that service a lot of seasonal voters. And so our cost of postage has increased and our mail service delivery had decreased. And so this has caused a lot of communities to turn toward internet as a mechanism to engage electors and actually save money. And then public attitudes. So some European studies have indicated there's been a decline of trust in the internet in Europe in more recent years, which is contrary to around the early 2000s. And yet public opinion in Canada is quite optimistic. So a survey that I recently carried out in 2014 in conjunction with the municipal elections, we surveyed paper voters and asked them, these are people who vote by paper, would you be interested in voting by internet in a future election? And 77% of them said, yes, absolutely, of course I would. 30% said they would no matter what, maybe they just didn't know about it this time around, but 47% said that they would under special circumstances, if they were sick, if they were away, if they injured themselves with the weather, inclement weather, so in special circumstances like that. So conclusion, so what can we draw from this? Well, different institutional and cultural contexts can impact how technology is applied and whether it's sustained. Less central control makes it easier to innovate, so to do more, but obviously the programs and development is less rigorous. And that subjective evaluation plays a role. A lot of Canadian communities continue with internet voting just with a simple, they sit around and say, okay, did turnout increase? Yep, it did, and then they go ahead and they move forward with it, much like how the UK ceased their trials. So overall, is internet voting in decline? Should we expect elections in Canada and Europe to become increasingly electronic? Currently, electronic voting is on the rise internationally. But there's been a lot of evidence, this is maybe a point for future research, that paper ballots actually perform better than voting equipment. Can paper ballots perform better than internet voting, or can internet voting perform better than paper ballots when it comes to invalid votes or residual vote counts? I'm not sure, but that's an area for research. I would argue that I think that the future of elections, we will see electronic elections, but I think that it may be a slower process than we think, and we will see computerized technology implemented in different phases of the election process first before we maybe see it used for voting. So, for example, in voters' lists, which is a big issue, voter registration, and then we'll slowly see a transition to voting. Thank you very much.